What's up, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. And for the newbies, how you doing? I'm RDBG. I'm a new channel discussing everything from light-skin monoracial issues, exotical issues, self-improvement, or just random commentary based on my observations of Blackistan and the world. In this video, I wanted to talk about the side effects of being light-skinned, or at least I will be reacting to Amanda Seales' podcast titled The Side Effects of Being Light-Skinned. She did a longer version that was like an hour long with Mona. I think she goes by Don't Call Me White Girl on her podcast. That was a really good conversation, but for the sake of time, I wanted to go through and answer the questions that she answered on her extension video. Now, I agree with most of what she said, but she did say in that video that light skinned women are not a monolith, so I want to put my 2 cents into the big bank. And I want to preface this by saying that when I use the word they, I pretty much mean anyone that's non exotical or just can't relate, because obviously brown skin exoticals can experience the same type of treatment. But for the sake of this video, we're focusing on being light skinned. So let's go.
First question. As a light-skinned person, at what age did you notice colorism? Do you ever feel guilty when you benefit from it? Like seeing clearly that you reaped a benefit because your shade was more favorable to the powers that be? I would say as a light-skinned person, at what age did I notice colorism? I think what's interesting is that I didn't notice it as colorism. I noticed it as like someone being a bad person. So for instance, when I would go visit my family in Grenada, I had a cousin, Michelle, rest in peace, who was dark skinned. And I won't even say she was dark skinned. She was just darker skinned than me, actually. And she was a brown skinned gal, stay home at 90, baby. And her grandmother was a white woman. Her grandmother was the white sister, half sister to my grandmother, because they both had the same father. And their father was the boss to my great grandmother, Dolly, who was a maid. Putting this together? Okay. Mind you, they also live in the same village. So my grandmother's sister, Teacher Doreen, she had a daughter named Pam. Pam was also just batshit crazy, but Pam married a brother, and they had Michelle. And what I noticed was that her grandparents would be like really mean to her in a way that they weren't mean to me. And I knew that we were both black because I was always aware of my blackness, but I never really understood why they were mean to her. And I didn't understand it as colorism because I didn't even think it was that simple. Like I thought it was maybe that they didn't like her father, or maybe they didn't like, her mom, or, but I didn't assign it to that. And it wasn't until I got older that I started to understand that that's what it was. But I would say that's the first time that I experienced it. I don't know the first time that I experienced colorism and had a consciousness that, oh, this is colorism. And
So maybe I'm being sensitive, but I think this question is insane. I think most people recall encountering their first experiences with isms around the age of 5 to 8 years old. But referencing back to my video about Kelly, if her guardian hadn't pointed out that what she was experiencing with that little boy was colorism, she probably wouldn't have had an idea of how to conceptualize it at that time. The same thing goes for light skinned children. I'm not saying kids can't be shitty, I've seen it. However, this is exactly what I mean when I say that people actually do think light skinned people are born inherently colorist. Like a superiority complex is your birthright of some sort. And on the same token, I feel like a lot of them view an inferiority complex as the birthright of a dark skinned person, instead of just viewing colorism and any other ism as the learned form of bigotry that it really is. And this is why I think internalized bigotry isn't viewed as the prevalent issue it truly is, because the self hate is so ingrained, they think hierarchy thinking is normal and is built into everyone and not just instilled in you during your upbringing. As a child, you have a vague sense of what's right and wrong because ethics is relative, right? Like you learn by example what's normal. So if you're surrounded by bigots, that'll be your normal. But light skinned people aren't genetically wired to just think we're better. Like she said, as a child, you notice people being mean, but you don't necessarily understand why most of the time. And you're a child, so you're probably more concerned with candy or playing and coloring and shit than you are toxic social dynamics. As a child, I remember aunts and other adult women being mean and weirdo toward me, but it wasn't until I was older that I realized what it stemmed from. I still had to experience the weaponization of colorism against me as I was growing up to be able to recognize it and conceptualize it. And even then, I still was in denial because I don't have a superiority complex. But again, that's just me.
And that leads to the next question, because when you ask, do you ever feel guilty when you benefit from it? I think that for a lot of people, there's this thought process that like you're casting for something and, like the dark skinned girl doesn't get picked and you get picked. And it's like, oh, well, they obviously picked me because I'm a light skinned girl. But I think something that I should clear up is that like, for the most part, like I haven't really seen there being a lot of times where there is like a mixture. I feel like there's been more of a awareness, I would say, lately of like, oh, we want this type of look for this and we want this type of look for this. But for the most part, I think that in the past few years, there has been more of a like, we need someone that represents black in like this very specific vision of what is black, right? And sometimes that for that person is like, she's got an afro, you know? Sometimes for that casting person, it's like, oh, like she has braids. And sometimes for that casting person, it's like, oh, it's this light skinned girl with curly hair. So like it really ends up being just like what they're asking for that ends up being the what their vision of blackness is that ends up being the thing. I think it's less what it was before, which was just like, if you're light, you're white. And you're right.
Actually glad she mentioned the quote unquote vision of blackness, particularly in Hollywood, because that makes me think about the representation conversation. And just that phrasing alone, the vision of blackness, makes me realize how paradoxical that conversation is. Because how can, on one hand, you're screaming that you need representation while shunning anyone who truly represents unambiguous blackness, while supporting the light skinned black people you claim aren't an accurate representation of blackness at a disproportionate rate? And it's very insulting that we're not considered an accurate representation of blackness, because how can't we? Right? Like we're black. If you have blackness, then you are a representation of blackness. Black people are not a monolith.
But in terms of like my feeling guilty, like I really haven't had a lot of experiences where I was in a counterpart situation with somebody. Like for the most part, my stuff has been like as an individual. You know, like me moving through the world as an individual. Like I'm doing spoken word as an individual. Like I'm singing as an individual. Like I'm hosting as an individual. Like when I got my job hosting on MTV, I don't even know who else interviewed for that job. And I think that's the other thing too, is that a lot of times like you're isolated. So like you're not even aware that that's the case. Now there's other scenarios that I could see somebody in where like, you know, in an academic setting, like everybody is going up for this like tenured position, you know, type of situation, or everybody is, you know, vying for this particular thing. But even in theater, when I was in school, like there wasn't that type of dynamic. So no, and I mean, I know there's going to be people who are watching, they're like, because you're not aware of it. And that's just simply not the case. The reality is that I just never found myself in a scenario where it was like a chorus line or like Top Model, where like we were all lined up and it was like, you go home, you sit down, you go home. You know, that wasn't it. I mean, I can tell you that the last time that I was in that situation was probably, that I can remember like off the top of my head right now, was when I was 8 auditioning for the Sparkling Christmas Spectacular at Disney. And I don't even know who else I was auditioning with because I was 8. But you know, in general, do I feel guilty about benefiting from colorism? I mean, no, I don't feel guilty as much as I feel responsible for, you know, doing what I can to undermine white supremacy. I think guilt in that situation is somewhat of an unuseful emotion. It's actually a selfish emotion to feel in that situation, because there's nothing action based around that. And it's not even your fault. Like you were born a certain way into a system that's trash. So the guilt of that to me is not useful as much as the awareness turned into action on how to undermine the perpetuating of it.
Exactly. Why would I feel guilty? Especially considering that I'm not a person who thinks in terms of hierarchy or centers white supremacy. I can't control the system. I can't control what goes on inside other people's head or their inferiority complex. And I couldn't control being born or being born with my phenotype. Just because you might allow a systemic problem to guilt you out of enjoying your existence and guilt you out of milking your privileges has nothing to do with me. Even if we take skin tone and race out of it, the same could be said for something like womanhood, for example. Everyone suffers under patriarchy, but women especially are second class citizens within this type of system. That doesn't make me hate being a woman or make me resentful toward men. And it damn sure doesn't stop me from living the life that I feel like I deserve. Because even with men being quote unquote privileged under a patriarchal umbrella, I still come across so many men I've quote unquote surpassed because I know how to milk the fuck out of the privileges I actually do have with no guilt.
Next question. How do you handle when someone says you don't look black enough to comment on black topics? How do I handle that? It depends on my mood for the day. You know, sometimes I just block them. I just chuckle and block them. Sometimes I respond with something snarky. You know, sometimes I'll just ask them like, well, who does look black enough to comment on topics? You know, who is black enough, right? Like, what's your criteria of blackness? Please, like, lay it out for me. But, you know, internally, my response is always, wow, they still got us in a chokehold. They've still got us in a chokehold. That we as a black community do not have a unified understanding that our experience and our existence of blackness in America is unique for the simple fact that we were entrenched in slavery for 400 years is beyond my scope of comprehension. Because what that says is that there are people who feel like if you were raped by a white slave owner and had a child, that child is no longer black. Even though you have experienced one of the worst side effects of being black in America as a parent, your child is not black because these people over here said that now that he has the white blood of a slave owner, he's no longer black. Like, our concept of what we consider black as an ethnicity has to be different than what black is considered as a race. Because the racism of blackness is not about love. The racism of blackness is not about unity. The racism of blackness is not about community. So we as black people cannot be basing blackness on the same criteria that the white supremacists and oppressive folks are basing our blackness on. It's not practical. It's not feasible for us to unify under. They literally have set up a system of oppression that if we are basing our blackness within that system of oppression, we are simply just oppressing ourselves. So, when I see, these different folks from different factions undermine someone else's blackness based on their adjacency to whiteness by nature of skin color or by parentage, that is weird to me. You have a black parent, you have black parents, you have light skin. Like, we can't just look at someone and be like, you're not black. Because that's not what black as an ethnicity should be existing in. And that's where the confusion happens, I think. That's where a lot of the conflict happens around, like, well, what is black? And, that's when people are like, well, why can't Rachel Dolezal be black? Well, because she's just not, right? She's just not. But when you look at, like, First Nations, we see that you can have an eighth of a tribe within you and you are still part of that tribe because it's in you. But I think so much of so many people in the black community consider blackness to be based on factors of struggle, factors of oppression, factors of discrimination. And ultimately, it's like, if that is what defines blackness, then they won. Which is why I always say every black experience is a black experience unless it is anti-black.
She's right. I mean, we're in a chokehold. We love the oppression because, like she said, it's a belonging to a club. It's a version of winning at something for them. And you can see this with how quickly Black people are to minimize any and everyone else's experience to remind them that Black people have it worse. I think associating Blackness and suffering is deeply rooted in religious psychosis, and the narrative is so upheld because in whatever version of Christianity we learned during slavery, it teaches that Blackness is a curse and is the furthest thing from godliness, and suffering is almost synonymous to righteousness. So I think subconsciously, or maybe even consciously, a lot of Black people believe that long suffering is the only way to win. But I also think that that ideology is another reason to evade personal responsibility and enable narcissistic behavior within our community. But but I'll get into that opinion more in depth in a video that I'm doing about Black people and religion.
Next question. Very confused by so many people in these comments not believing colorism is a real thing. I'd like you to discuss how light-skinned people like to ignore colorism, similar to the ways that white folks ignore racism. Well, one thing I will say, let me just start off, is that it is, I feel, very offensive when you compare light-skinned black people's experience or their commentary, et cetera, to white people. Because it really tries to suggest that, like, light-skinned people have the same access to whiteness that white people have. And they don't. The only time a light-skinned person has access to whiteness is if they act as if they are white. Like, they don't get to be a black person who's light-skinned and have access to whiteness. The two are not interchangeable. You must completely absolve yourself of blackness and live as a white person. And that means that you are now passing. And if you're passing, that means you've completely disconnected yourself from this ethnicity, this culture, this life. And that's its own trauma in its own way. I think to answer your question about why do so many light-skinned people not think colorism exists, I think what really is happening is that there is a version of colorism that dark-skinned black folks experience that is far more obvious than the benefit of colorism that light-skinned people experience. And so a lot of light-skinned people are like, and I can tell you, like, I'm like, well, I haven't outwardly had anyone ever say to me, I like you better because you're light-skinned, or I chose you because you're light-skinned, or you're the best choice because you're light-skinned. Never. Whereas there are dark-skinned people who can 1000% tell you, I have been told you're ugly because you're dark-skinned. I've been told you're less valuable because you're dark-skinned. I've been told this because you're dark-skinned. You understand what I'm saying? So there is a very obvious, clear example of colorism that many dark-skinned people have experienced that many light-skinned people have not either witnessed or that have not experienced themselves. And so I don't think they're saying that colorism doesn't exist, but I think what they're saying is that the version of privilege that many folks assign to light-skinned black folks, they don't feel like they have experienced. And, I will say this. I think there's something to be said for always remembering that white supremacy has a way of being very surreptitious. Sometimes it's very outward and very conspicuous, but sometimes it's very inconspicuous. And that's why, like, there does have to be a heightened alertness, right? There just has to be a heightened consciousness about how you challenge things and how you address things. I also think that there's a certain grace that we don't give each other as black women around that. And I think that there's an ignorance that some light-skinned women have around that, and there's a lack of curiosity around it that they have that they definitely need to be more conscious of and more aware of. I also think that there's an undermining of light-skinned black women's experiences, and there's a disbelief of light-skinned black women's experiences that often gets attributed to something that is disregard versus a experience. So what I'm saying is that, like, there's, I think for a lot of people, this idea that, like, well, if you're a light-skinned person that says that you didn't experience colorism, then you're full of it, and you're full of it because you don't care about dark-skinned women. And I think that's the road that we end up going down, that causes the fissure and the chasm between all of us. When in our best selves, we would be as curious as we are judgmental. We got to take out the judge and be curious. And I think one of the biggest issues is that a lot of dark skinned black women don't see light skinned black women as their sisters. So they see them as adversaries. So when they tell their experience, even if they're asked it, it's seen as not another black woman telling her experience, but more so a light skinned black woman denying a dark skinned black woman's experience. And I don't think that's the case every time. It might be the case sometimes, but it's never been the case with me. And I know it's not the case with a lot of light skinned women, as well as I know there's a lot of dark skinned women who are absolutely like, nah, you don't experience privilege. I've experienced that. I've had dark skinned women mad at me for saying I have light skin privilege. Because they're like, why are you even saying that there's anything better about being light skinned? I'm like, I'm not saying that there's anything better about being light skinned. What I'm saying, though, is that by proximity to whiteness, that's what colorism is. And they're like, you're trying to make it out like light skinned women are better or light skinned women have it better, but you're not any better. So sometimes I think you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But that's why we have to have these conversations.
1000% correct. People have always been self centered. I just think it's more normalized now to be outwardly selfish in society because the environment encourages individualism. And I don't always think that's the worst thing, especially if you know how to balance it, because in a balanced person, it just equals boundaries. It's impossible to take on the burdens of everyone else. And frankly, that would be exhausting, especially when life starts to life for you as an individual. It's as if they don't realize we're not light skinned NPC bots on autoplay, just skipping around carelessly and flaunting our light skin privilege. We are people who have lives and problems just like everyone else. And if we happen to look/be joyful, it's a deliberate choice, not an emotion attained from looking down at dark skinned people from the raggedy ass pedestal that they put us on. I don't think it's that we ignore or pretend that colorism, featureism, and texturism don't exist. It's just that those things are optional beliefs that could just go away if you decided not to believe it. Light skin privilege isn't like white supremacy, where there are blatant and covert infrastructures in place to reinforce and maintain white supremacy. Light skinned people aren't at Capitol Hill stripping you of your human rights or militarizing police to keep dark skinned people in check. Some of us just said that our black is also beautiful and it's not oppressive for us to be proud of it as light skinned people. I'm glad she mentioned that light skinned black people are confused about this quote unquote privilege because unambiguous black people typically have this exaggerated idea of what they think light skinned privilege actually does. Half of the privilege is just having others constantly verbalizing that we're privileged, even if that statement is followed by them trying to make our lives hell in order to humble us and counter the exaggerated belief they have. When it comes to privileges, I look at it this way. Even if white privilege annoys me when I see it in action, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it or being bitter that the playing field isn't as level in some situations. But maybe because I accept reality and I spend more time leveraging what I have to get what I want. Does that mean I have to be more strategic in some situations? Absolutely, but that's life. Because just like I said, with men benefiting from patriarchy, there are white people I have quote unquote surpassed as well because I focus on what I can do with what I have than what might stop me from getting what I want. I'm also glad she mentioned the narc-esque way that unambiguous black women think that caring about our own experience as exoticals means we don't care about theirs. I'll never understand not respecting other people's existence and experience. I noticed that black people, even though they like to pretend that they don't, have issues with coexisting with people who are different from them, like bigots from any other group. Like, this town ain't big enough for the both of us. Like, we all can be in this bitch, just experiencing life. It's okay. I don't understand how they keep missing that light skinned black women are very much so marginalized. Not only are we double minorities, we're a minority subset of a double minority group. And maybe it is our privilege that we are accustomed to being pushed out of the group because that makes us realize that blackness doesn't automatically make you a loser in the game. Being pushed out of the group seems to have helped us evade toxic groupthink. So my lack of curiosity isn't because I don't believe colorism exists. I just found more positive, fulfilling things to think about. And having that option is not a light skin privilege because I could easily choose to be a light skinned savior, just like a dark skinned person could choose to love themselves despite conditioning easily. And let's talk about her last point that there are dark skinned women who will say light skin privilege doesn't exist. So, does it or doesn't it? Even if you do try to acknowledge your privilege, and let's be clear, acknowledging your privilege isn't necessarily you agreeing you're above, better, or more beautiful in comparison to someone else. It's simply agreeing that you may or may not benefit from the stereotype that's imposed on you. That's why I'll always say that colorism only survives strictly because of jealousy. And it's not necessarily only jealousy toward a light skinned person's appearance. Because if I'm not better and light skin isn't special and can't save me from mistreatment, and my experience isn't any different from any other black woman, so there's no way you could be jealous, what the fuck is the problem? Obviously, black women are resilient in general, but I think light skinned women have a better sense of survival instincts, or what I think the equivalent of what EU would call um, being better social climbers. So, is that why colorism is almost exclusively called out when it comes to light skinned women accomplishing something or obtaining something other black women find desirable? Why not just congratulate her if she isn't more privileged? It's because you're jealous and want to contribute the internal value she has for herself to an external locus of control because their low self esteem can't fathom valuing themselves outside of the white or male gaze. I'm a pretty objective person in general. And in most scenarios I've seen where people are crying colorism, the claim is typically used as a coping mechanism for the person who's usually in a one sided competition, might I add, and they just need an excuse for not being where they want to be due to the lack of accountability in their own lives.
Next question. I'm light skinned, born of two light skinned parents, and it bothers me to be lumped into one category with mixed race people with a non black parent, especially when discussing the privileges of being able to pass when I obviously can't. How do y'all feel about being light skinned versus biracial and some people's unwillingness to acknowledge the difference? I mean, I just think it's a matter of people just wanting to exercise cognitive dissonance. The truth is right in front of you. Like, there's just factual based evidence that two dark skinned black people can make a light skinned kid. Like, I mean, two brown skinned black people can make a light skinned kid. A white woman and a dark skinned black man can make a white child and then make a dark skinned black child. Like, genes and all this stuff is very mysterious on how the melanin decides to flow. But I think there's something very different in terms of just kind of the realities that, like, you can be a biracial person that's black and you can be a light skinned person that has two black parents that's black. And the difference is simply that you want to be acknowledged for the truth of your actual existence. Like, when I tell people, when I get annoyed when people say, oh, Amanda has a white parent, it's because not only do I not have a white parent, so I just like the truth to be the truth, but two, I know they're trying to say it to undermine the validity of my existence as a black person. And I think that's where a lot of folks feel some type of way, is that there's like an undermining, like there's an invalidation that's happening. And that's not fair. It's also just simply erroneous, and it goes along the lines of alternative facts and this idea that you can just make up a reality simply because it fits the opinion that you want to move with. And that's just not the way the world should work. You know, facts are not opinions, period. And once you know the facts, it should change your opinion if your opinion was based on an alternative fact.
She's very correct. Again, I don't understand the need to try to invalidate another black person's experience. But I will say, I think the cognitive dissonance is rooted in jealousy, as I said before. Even if they refuse to admit it, the reaction some of them have to you just standing there minding your business says everything. And from my experience, it's like, how dare you be fully black and light skinned and have loose textured hair and ethnic, but not too ethnic features and be perceived as beautiful and get to experience fluidity without feeling guilt. For example, the recent beauty store debacle, right? The girl was just minding her fucking business. I mean, that bitch is white, big old fat, nasty white hoe, just like this bitch right here. Pink bitch, you nasty bitch. And I don't even have nothing against biracial women. I just don't like the stanky ones with white mothers like you, bitch. I hate you. I hate you, bitch. I hate you, bitch. Get the fuck out of here, bitch! Like, look at this. Like, this is crazy. I've never seen an exotical be this hateful, like just openly hateful and just like that raw kind of hate toward another black person. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I just have never seen it. I frankly just don't even think we would get away with it, to be honest. Like, look at that. Like, that's the kind of hate that you see in like civil rights photos with white people throwing shit at Ruby Bridges or some shit. I wouldn't consider this lady to be particularly dark. Her mom I would consider dark skinned, but she does have unambiguous features. And based on how she keeps talking about this mixed girl's hair, she probably has 4C hair. So she, is not benefiting from featurism and texturism. So just that display of like visceral hate. I mean, that's crazy to me. I ain't never seen that. Like, I've never physically seen anybody behave like that in person. Like, I would have tased her ass, minimum.
Next question. Why aren't there dark skinned folk on this episode since we have the most knowledge surrounding this topic? Why would you have the most knowledge surrounding the experience of being light skinned? If I saw light skinned folks on an episode titled Side Effects of Being Dark Skinned, I would be very confused. But this is what I was talking about earlier, which is this idea that as a light skinned Black woman, I don't have my own experience. And I don't think you understand how degrading that is to suggest. I don't think you understand how unfair it is to suggest that. And I don't think you understand how disconnecting it is between us to suggest that. A dark skinned Black woman's experience is her own, and it is for nobody to speak to. A light skinned Black woman's experience is also her own. And her speaking her experience should not undermine the value and merit of your own dark skin experience as a woman. And ultimately, until we as Black women can come to understand the uniqueness of our experiences and move beyond struggle Olympics, which is what a lot of us do. Because then you have light skinned women who are like, well, I struggled too, and I had to go through this as well. So this is me. And it's like, what are we doing? This is not helpful by any means. But I think that was a really disrespectful question. And I don't think that it was well thought out. I also didn't choose these questions, so blame it on Jeremiah. This episode is also called Side Effects of Being Light-Skinned, not Side Effects of Colorism. And those are two different things. Those are absolutely two different things. If we were doing an episode on colorism and we didn't have light-skinned people on the panel, it would be whatever. But if we were doing an episode on being light-skinned and didn't have light-skinned people on the panel, then what are we talking about? So that is the difference. And I think that what I love about Small Doses is that this is a podcast that speaks to people's experiences. And though we use topics and themes to do so, sometimes I think people get caught up in the fact that one person speaking their experience cannot speak for an entire topic and theme. Right? So like even me and Mona talking about our light-skinned experience, well, I mean, that doesn't speak for the entire experience of light-skinnedness. It's side effects of being light-skinned. Well, we're two people who are light-skinned, so these are our side effects. And that's really the point of the conversations, is to bring perspective, because the perspective gives us the opportunity to find new answers and new solutions and new understandings. And in my opinion, that is what brings us together.
They think this way because they view our mere existence as a colorist slight. Like, seriously, you being born is offensive, and it makes your parents, your DNA, and God a colorist because you came out different from that. I agree with Amanda. It absolutely is offensive because how dare you assume I'm a basic ass hierarchy minded bigot just because you are? You don't think I got better shit to worry about than your skin tone? Throwing us in and out of blackness doesn't remove our blackness or the experience we have as Black women. We have our own experience, and that's why we're finally stepping in to speak for ourselves. What's crazy is that they'll say we don't care about colorism when in reality, I think we've just been gaslit for so long as exotical Black women. Now we just default to fixing our problems instead of loudly complaining because, as you can see here, even with this question that was posed, that they don't even think we have a unique experience, let alone deserve to speak on it. Like, what is it? Please stick to your fucking guns for once. Are we all the same or not? Damn. And I said this in another video. I think dark skinned women and unambiguous women are so used to being heard and not seen. And light skinned women and other exoticals are so used to being seen and not heard that not having a safe space has done wonders for the collective branding of exoticals because we had no choice but to default to ownership and execution instead of just being loud, emotionally driven, but somehow still actionless SJWs. That's why, even as Black women, we're not associated with being angry. Sure, while we are associated with being superficial, gold diggers, conniving women who, are just always trying to come up, nothing's wrong with that stereotype because nothing's wrong with positioning yourself to be better in society. The fuck? But as I mentioned before, even after strategically overcoming your problems, even if they stood right next to you and watched you struggle and watched all of your progress, they'll still try to gaslight you by saying you think you're better. And then when you win, they'll say it's strictly your privilege at play. Which, like, whatever, that's fine. Because I don't care to win whatever competition it is that they're creating in their minds. I just want to win at life.
Next question. It would be interesting to hear your perspective on the connection between colorism, texturism, and featureism. Ooh, child, this sounds like a dissertation. And how these three oppressive social systems impact darker skinned Black women particularly. What are some impactful steps, actions light skinned Black people can take to combat these ills? In what ways have you fought against these isms in your career or personal life? So colorism, texturism, and featureism. So colorism, of course, we're talking about the skin color as it is in respect to whiteness, like not respect, but in proximity to whiteness. Texturism, we're talking about hair texture. So, from the one, I guess 1A down to the 4C. And then featureism, when we're talking about, features that are more typically considered African features versus more Anglo-Saxon features, right? So when we look at, beautiful broad noses and beautiful full lips and bodies that are shapely, etc. I think, the isms is a doozy, right? Because the isms exist everywhere. So it's beyond this. You have, classism, you have racism, you have sexism. All of these things end up intersectionally affecting a number of folks. But I think in this regard, as you put it, I would say that a lot of people feel like the way these things disproportionately affect darker skinned Black women is at the root colorism first. I think that at the root is the colorism first that plants the seed, and then the texturism and the featureism come out of that, because it becomes like, oh, you're even blacker because you wear your hair in this way, or you're even blacker because you have your nose in this, because your nose is this shape, etc. And that then compounds the pervasiveness of white as right. As a light-skinned Black person, I am very conscious of representation. I'm very conscious of making sure that if I'm in a space that's supposed to be like representing Blackness, that I am not the blackest person there, the darkest person there. I'm very conscious in my casting choices when I'm thinking about my own projects about how I can make sure that there are various versions of Blackness being accounted for and showing up. And that's beyond just texturism and featureism and colorism, but that also goes to, making sure that there are folks represented from the LGBTQIA plus community, making sure there are folks represented from the disabled community, etc. So just trying to have a consciousness, always keeping that consciousness, and always holding others to that consciousness when I can, right? When I have the power to, bringing that to the attention of folks. I think I gave an example when we were doing the episode about how like I was supposed to do like a line with this fashion designer from Russia, and she basically was calling the next line like an honor to Africa or whatever, and she wanted me to be the spokesperson. And I was just like, absolutely not. Like I can only do this if there's a counterpart that is actually from Africa, perhaps a model that is from Africa, since I'm not a model, right? So like maybe I'm like the haha spot ta ta, spokesperson, but the face is a dark-skinned Black woman that is actually from the continent. And they were like, well, we don't understand why this is even necessary, because I mean, she's not racist, she's from Russia, like we don't even see race. And I'm just like, the fact that you even said we don't even see race to tell you that. And you know what was crazy too? The designer would not get on the phone with me. Like they kept making me talk to her publicist, and I was like, how the fuck you want me to come and be the spokesperson for your shit when you don't even get on the phone with me? And I remember we were just like on BBM, and she essentially just they were like, we don't want to do this with you because you're too difficult. And I was like, so be it. But I may be difficult, but you racist motherfuckers. And ultimately, you just thought, oh, yeah, she's fine. But instead of being educated by what I was telling them, they were perturbed. And that's often the case with folks, right? So that's why you have to use your privilege whenever you can, because you have to be the one that is going to disrupt the space without being the one who the space is being disrupted for. Because then you are now tasking folks with being their own saviors or their own heroes or their own fighters. And ultimately, that just shouldn't be the case. I mean, I do think that sometimes there's a very like high expectation for people to have for light skinned people to have like a heightened awareness of like what they need to do. But I think we also need to remember that people inherently are selfish AF. And so the other thing that I've learned about, particularly in Hollywood, is that like there really isn't a Black sisterhood here in the way that people think there is. And I think what some people may look at as like, oh, you're not advocating for, or you're not in support of, may actually be that no, that person is a bitch. And so I'm not supporting them because they have a darker skin. I'm not supporting them because they're a bitch. It has nothing to do with their skin color. It has everything to do with their character.
Why?
Why? Why? Why? Why? Why?
Why are they always asking what we can do as light-skinned Black people? Like, we're the only ones who need to be fighting fucking isms, as if we're the only ones upholding them. Why is it not Black people in general that need to be fighting against isms? Why is it that the minority group of the minorities is tasked with correcting such a major issue within our community? Especially when there are light-skinned people at the butt end of isms being told that they're ugly because they have the same unambiguous features as some of their dark-skinned peers. Internalized white supremacy is a community issue, and people should be tasked with taking accountability for their own lives. Shit, the idea that only white or light people can actually make a difference is in itself internalized bigotry. A community can never improve until people start to take personal responsibility first. Because if not, internalized bigots will always be squandering the work of these light skinned saviors they're waiting for with the excuse of the system made me hate myself. I'll never listen to Black people say that. Why? Because I come from a predominantly Black place, like most places where Black people congregate in the South, and have physically watched Black people deliberately choose to hate themselves and other Black people and make choices that prove that. I'm talking places where the self hate is so rampant, the police don't even go there because they don't feel like they need to. They don't need to put a knee on your neck if you're going to do it for them. And I'm glad she brought up the fact that nobody wants to advocate for entitled people with nasty attitudes. A lot of Black women, shit, and men too, think that being quote unquote oppressed by the almighty system absolves them of accountability for their horrible character. So it's always funny to me when they try to use the same excuse to justify being prejudiced toward light skinned people, as if the same reasoning can't be applied in the case of a dark skinned person. It's like, ho, you calling the wrong organ ugly. It ain't your skin. Your heart is ugly. Light skinned people need to advocate for me. Pull me up too. No. And it's not because I hate your skin. I just hate you, baby girl. You're horrible. I'm not attaching my credibility to you. The fuck?
Next question. Actually, before I go on to that question, I want to add too, though, that like, I guess there's this idea that because there is colorism, that light skinned Black women don't deserve any level of protection in the space, that we don't deserve sisterhood in spaces, that we don't, not even that we don't deserve, but that we don't need it. You know, because basically what that says is like, well, because you have proximity to whiteness, you don't need or deserve closeness with Blackness. And I can speak for many light skinned Black women in saying that that is not true. And even though we don't experience colorism, that ostracism is very damaging and isolating. And ultimately, we are still Black women and we want to be with our sisters. Now, the ones who ain't on that, fuck them. You understand me? Fuck them.
The irony is that even with ostracism, they'll still expect the advocacy of light skinned women, while, like she said, viewing us as adversaries. Like, make that narcissistic ass one sided allyship make sense. I think the confusion about this being a true allyship is that dark skinned Black women view their participation in the pedestalization of light skinned women as a bigger favor than it actually is and has been. And it seems that there's a sense of betrayal that comes from light skinned women not always being able to use our proximity to whiteness, aka palatability, as a segue to their acceptance by white society and or the male gaze, which they're accepted anyway. Divestors say this all the time. But I think their collective ego wants the acceptance to be louder. I don't know. But either way, we can't change other people's attitudes toward anyone. If we could, life would be much easier. And going back to light skinned women desiring closeness to Blackness, and I'm speaking from a specifically monoracial perspective, I think they don't understand that when we went over there, as into white spaces, we're like, baby, ain't shit popping over there. That was just for the come up. We like to stay connected to our Blackness, which makes sense because that's who we are. We just have fluidity, which I do view as as a privilege personally. However, I'm not going to feel guilty and start light skin savioring just because you've allowed yourself to keep accepting toxic societal conditioning. Like, sure, intersectionality exists, but sweetie, intersectionality exists outside of the superficial shit as well. So you can't expect someone to prioritize your experience over the experience they're actively living. Life is life for everyone. All you can do is ask for empathy and space to talk about and do what you got to do to fix your own issues, which is exactly what MLS women have decided to do by creating the exotical space, because we simply can't relate to some things and vice versa.
Last question. What conversations need to be had with each other and our children in order to be more supportive of each other, light, medium, and dark, as Black women collectively?
I know this got cut off because that was like the end of the video, but I think the only conversations that need to be had outside of the home are conversations about staying on code with teaching the next generation self love and making a true effort to keep internalized racism from infiltrating future generations. But that'd be impossible because there's no way to know which Black people actually are self haters. It'll only get more difficult as dating out becomes less and less taboo. And I never think it actually was. I just think Black people like to project their performative pro Blackness onto Black women more heavily in order to gaslight us into being quote unquote race loyal and producing Black babies despite the fucked up community conditions they be born into. But Black women are starting to open up their options a lot more. But it's obviously very difficult to determine which Black women are opening up their options out of the simple fact that they would like to have a fulfilling relationship at the end of the day and they just don't discriminate about who is with or whether they're pursuing relationships with people of other races because they want to create children who are born into the perceived light skin privilege or, exotical privilege. But anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. And if you want to join the conversation, be sure to hit up that comment section and be very Zamir, very mindful, and let me know what you thought about these questions. And be sure to subscribe if you like the video because I'd love to see you next time. Adios.
Why? 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 Why?